Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today at the Columbia Journalism Review. I'm Betsy Moraes, the editor of CJR. And we're here for a live taping of CJR's podcast, The Kicker, which is hosted by Megan Greenwell. Megan took over The Kicker at the start of the new year and has done a wonderful job positioning it as a forum for real talk. And that includes everything about working in journalism and navigating the challenges of this industry. And certainly managing legal risk is a major part of that. And we're seeing that more and more in so many different ways that we'll talk about today. So we're very fortunate to be joined by David Enrich, who's an editor at the New York Times, who writes often about the intersection of law and business, including the challenges being posed to the First Amendment and libel law. And he is the author most recently of Murder the Truth, which is about legal attacks on press freedom. And we're joined by Jameel Jaffer, who's the executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia. Under his leadership, the Institute has filed precedent-setting litigation, and he has personally been a voice of reason and wisdom at moments of distress for free speech and the press. What you hear today will be soon turned into an episode of The Kicker. You'll be able to find that and much more at cjr.org and by signing up for our daily newsletter. Megan, take it away. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you to the listeners, and thank you to David and Jameel for doing this. I'm excited about this conversation. I guess to sort of set the scene, I want to hear from you both about how you characterize this moment in terms of what is going on broadly in terms of freedom of the press and sort of what the historical context is for what we're seeing now.
Bad. Yeah, it's not good. Should I go first? Do you want to go first?
I agree with you so far.
My background in this, I'm not a lawyer or really even a First Amendment expert, but I started getting obsessed about this issue several years ago, like 5 or 6 years ago, because I do investigative reporting and editing at the Times, and like we were just getting besieged by legal threats every time we even started to think about reporting on something, it felt like. And, you know, the Times is blessed with excellent in-house legal counsel and, you know, relatively speaking, infinite resources. But it just got me wondering what this experience would be like getting assaulted with all these legal threats if I didn't have the privilege of working at a place like the Times. And so I started calling around to all these independent journalists and lawyers and publishers and asking them what they were seeing. They were seeing all these horror stories. And so this became kind of the basis for the book that I was writing, which published in early 2025. It was finished, I had finished writing it basically right around the time of the 2024 election. And I thought, look at this landscape is terrible. There's so many things going on that are really fundamentally threatening the ability of journalists and publishers to do their jobs properly. And then Trump won the election, and I felt like everything I'd written was just completely like anachronistic and outdated. And this past year has just been, it seems like on a weekly or monthly basis, there is some new thing that is happening, whether it's, you know, press credentials being threatened or people getting kicked out of the Pentagon or the sitting president suing news outlets over completely accurate and fair coverage. There's just one thing after another, and then seeing big news organizations in some cases capitulate. And so I think the landscape right now is worse than, I mean, certainly in my lifetime than it's ever been. And I don't think we've seen really anything quite like this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's bad. I don't think we've, at least in modern American history, had a president who was so hostile to the freedoms of the press and speech. So that's one big piece of it. But I think that what we're seeing is the Trump administration really exposing weaknesses that were in our system, were sort of latent in the system, really exploiting those weaknesses. With the result that it turns out that an administration that really wants to turn the screws on journalists has a lot of different ways of doing that, and not just on sort of journalists, but on news organizations and even sort of more broadly technology companies that give us our information. The administration has a lot of ways of manipulating and censoring and suppressing public debate. Kind of rigging democratic discourse, and a lot of this stuff, again, sort of existed before Trump came along, and we're now seeing that maybe we should have been focused on this or more focused on it 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But now it's all being exploited kind of at once. I mean, some of it has to do with the law. I guess everything has to do with the law at some degree of remoteness, but some of it is directly about the law, and some of it is more about kind of free speech, culture, and the media, the sort of organization of the media ecosystem. I guess have the opposite problem that David does. I'm not a journalist, so I come at this with a sort of narrow perspective that's a lawyer's perspective. But I am now just coming very belatedly to the realization that a lot of the biggest problems relating to journalism and the public's right to know aren't things that can be fixed very easily with a legislative amendment or even a constitutional amendment. It doesn't have to do with the law so directly. It has to do with a broader set of political, economic, cultural forces that are obviously affected by the law, but at a distance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit more about the historical context with both of you, because you started writing your book, David, before Trump was reelected, before a lot of the recent stuff has happened. Jameel, you run a center that obviously predates this presidential administration. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here and what those weaknesses were that are now being exploited maybe in a new way, but are not new themselves.
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, so some of them, I think the easiest ones to identify, are related to, the First Amendment or closely related statutory schemes that are meant to protect press freedom and free speech. So, for example, the law, the Supreme Court case relating to compelled disclosure of journalist sources is, from 50 years ago, notoriously opaque. Nobody really knows what it ultimately means, and the result is that the protection that journalists can get from the courts when their sources are demanded from when the government demands their sources is very limited. Mm-hmm. They've had to rely on legislatures instead, and state legislatures have passed these press shield laws that are often very important and very effective. But there's no federal press shield law, and the result is that there's no statutory protection either. So there's no Supreme Court protection, and there's no statutory protection. So all that's left then is the grace of the executive branch. And over time, successive presidential administrations strengthened the internal Justice Department rules that protect journalists. And the Biden administration, to its credit, had the strongest iteration of this, basically outside the national security context, categorically protecting journalists from disclosing their sources, nearly categorically from protecting journalists from disclosing their sources in response to compelled process by the government. But that was all internal to the Justice Department. It turned on, the grace of the president at the time, and now we have a different president who, isn't interested in providing those protections, and he has swept them away. The Justice Department has swept them away, and I think some of what we've seen over the last few weeks, and in particular the search of Heather Natanson's, the raid of her home and the seizure of her phones and laptops. That is a result of these protections being swept away. So, that's a place where it's very easy to identify the gap in the law. Congress could fill that gap, or the courts could hold that the First Amendment gives reporters certain protections when the government demands their sources. They haven't done it yet. It would have been nice if they had done it earlier. But now we can see see even more clearly that there's that gap, and try to, if we ever have a moment where we can kind of try to build again, we can try to build those protections in a stronger form. And there are other things like that. I mean, I don't want to go on, but there are other sort of narrow areas where you could imagine Congress, for example, strengthening the Freedom of Information Act in certain ways to, especially in the landscape of national security, the Freedom of Information Act is almost useless. And there are ways that Congress could strengthen those rights that would have a real impact on accountability journalism. That's the easy stuff.
Useless? I think FOIA is so useful. I mean, it could be better, but we use FOIA. We file FOIA requests every single day.
You do, but on national security issues?
I mean, yeah, I'm not personally, but we file a ton of FOIA requests. It's that is the gift that keeps on giving.
So I litigated a lot of FOIA requests. In fact, along with David McCraw, we litigated some cases involving drone strikes during the Obama administration. And these were, I think, by many measures, the most successful national security FOIA cases, among the most successful national security cases ever filed. But at the end of the day, what we got was formal government recognition of what everybody already knew. And everybody already knew it because Charlie Savage had already reported it based on leaks from the administration. And I think that's that's the high point of national security FOIA litigation. In most cases, if the government wants to withhold things on national security grounds, it can. And journalists, other tools are actually much more powerful than FOIA. That's my experience. But I think there are ways that Congress could strengthen the hands of the courts, and by doing that, strengthen the position of journalists and advocacy and research organizations that sue for the release of information.
So I was going to answer your question in a different way, because I am, as I said, not a lawyer. And to me, I spent a lot of time in this book and during the book research, kind of going back to 1964 and the New York Times versus Sullivan decision, which obviously is the kind of foundational stone upon which so much of the First Amendment and freedom of the press is now based. And the thing that I found really interesting as I kind of learned about this from scratch, I think every journalist should know about New York Times versus Sullivan, and I don't think most of us do, and I know I certainly did not until, at least not in any subtle or nuanced way, until I started doing this research. And one of the interesting things is everyone kind of knows what the decision does, and everyone knows that it's now under attack. What I at least didn't realize until I got deep in this is that up until very recently, there was this really widespread, almost universal consensus that it was a correctly decided case and it should be protected at all costs. That was across the political spectrum. Even Clarence Thomas, who is now its loudest critic, was apparently in favor of it and certainly not vocally criticizing it. And I find that change interesting because I think it's not just about different kind of changing interpretations of the law and the Constitution. It's much more about this long kind of project by people primarily on the right to sow distrust in the media. And I think that rising distrust or eroding trust in the mainstream media in particular is a big part of the reason that Trump and his allies have they've been so effective in weaponizing attacks on the media and getting away with it. And I've spent a lot of time kind of soul searching just about what the media got wrong that allowed these attacks to become so potent. And I mean, I don't have a great answer, but the closest I think I've gotten to it is that the media, and certainly including, but in no ways limited to the New York Times, we've really failed at a very basic thing, which is being transparent and accountable to our readers and to people that we write about a lot. And I do not think we've been, and again, this is not anything specific that I'm talking about, although we could get into specifics if people want to, where, we're very good in, like the New York Times is and other news organizations are as well, and when we spell someone's name wrong or get a date wrong or something like that, we correct those mistakes. We're much less good at really grappling with big kind of existential things that maybe we get wrong. Like maybe we came down too hard on like a certain person or group of people, or maybe we got our coverage wrong and we prioritized something where we should have prioritized something else. And there's very rarely a moment where, and I can point to a couple of recent examples where I think we have gotten things a little bit wrong, not through any fault of our own, but like I think the Hunter Biden laptop story is a really good example of we were all, and I had nothing to do with this, and I'm not speaking about the New York Times in particular, but the media in general, you know, there was a laptop that had lots of stuff on it, and the mainstream media, with some exceptions, did not write about it and actively encouraged censorship of it, I think, because we were all so preoccupied with this idea of Russia or other governments colluding or trying to skew the election. And I think there are examples on the left, I think there are examples on the right, and I think that there has been such opacity and lack of responsiveness by leaders in the mainstream media to these sometimes valid critiques. Some of the critiques are not valid at all, but sometimes the critiques are valid. And historically, I think we have in the media generally kind of turned up our nose at this type of criticism and said, we have good processes and procedures for dealing with this. We will deal with it internally, and we will let you know when we have something to say. And I think that kind of mode of thinking is just completely outdated and obsolete in the current digital, social media friendly era in which we exist. And so I think there really needs to be, to me, the key task of like journalists right now and journalistic leaders is to rebuild the trust that has been lost among readers and among the public across the political spectrum. And one of the key first steps to doing that, I think, is to really thinking about how we can be more transparent about how we go about doing our jobs. And I think one of the great things about that added transparency is, with plenty of exceptions, by and large, we do a really good job of it. You know, there's lots of journalists, almost all of them acting in good faith. Yes, we're human. Yes, we make mistakes. But by and large, we try really, really hard, day in and day out, to figure out what the truth is and communicate that clearly to our readers. And I think that you know, when I talk to friends about like how I do my job and how my colleagues do their jobs and how my competitors do their jobs, people are always amazed by the care and rigor and patience that professional journalists are using. And I think that is a message that has been completely lost to the vast majority of the public. And I think that if there's a greater understanding of how seriously we take our responsibilities, that would really do a lot to blunt some of these criticisms that we are constantly facing.
I wonder whether the decision to get rid of the public editor, I mean, I know you're not talking about the Times specifically, but I think you know, obviously the public editor tends to focus on things that have gone wrong, right? And I think that for that reason, the publisher and the editors don't always love reading the public editor's columns. But focusing on the things that have gone wrong also, you know, sort of by implication sort of suggests that, you know, this is not the norm. Like the norm is something else, right? And I actually wonder whether, I know I'm obviously not the first person to have suggested this, but whether it was really myopic to, you know, get rid of the public editor. I think overall, having the public editor actually increases people's confidence in the, you know, in the paper.
I don't even know what the counter argument to that would be, other than that it's a pain in the butt when you're a journalist doing really good work to find a colleague of yours criticizing that or interrogating that, and that sucks, right? It just does. But I don't know what the counter argument is to it from a public credibility standpoint.
I don't know.
But to what extent does any of this matter? When I agree, journalists should be more transparent, but also transparency isn't going to convince Donald Trump to trust the New York Times or whatever outlet it is, right? That seems off the table. Clarence Thomas seems to have turned against New York Times versus Sullivan because of admirably transparent negative coverage of him. Alan Dershowitz is now against New York Times versus Sullivan because of admirably transparent coverage of him. And so if we have a culture where people are just upset at any critical coverage of them, even when they're the people with the most power in our society, does that fix anything?
Well, look, I mean, Alan Dershowitz may be one of the noisiest people in America, but he certainly doesn't speak for a majority of people. Neither does Clarence Thomas, neither does Neil Gorsuch. And, there is, as far as we know, 7 other people on the Supreme Court that currently do believe in New York Times versus Sullivan. And I do think with Trump, you're right, like nothing is going to make Trump trust the mainstream media. I don't even know if Trump distrusts the mainstream media. Trump doesn't like the mainstream media because the mainstream media investigates him and holds him accountable in a way few other institutions do. But I think the reason these attacks matter, whether it's from Trump or from the Supreme Court or from Alan Dershowitz, is the degree to which they resonate with people and they get traction. And I feel like that is the single best, that's what we can control. People in this room, people listening to this podcast, like the professional journalists out there, what we can control is the public sentiment toward us and toward our industry, and which is a reflection, at least in part. Some of it's bad faith attacks that are people lying or skewing things to undermine us, but some of it is a legitimate and at times valid reaction to us. Again, I'm not talking about the New York Times, just to be really clear here, but just like to media institutions or individual journalists screwing up and not owning those mistakes, or at least not reckoning with those mistakes in a public and transparent way. And I feel like if we were better at having those talks and maybe reaching across the aisle more, not like the political aisle, but just like to our critics, and thinking about trying to hear what they're saying and trying to bring them into a conversation and maybe give them some more transparency. I'm maybe being hopelessly naive here. I probably am, as these words escape my mouth. But I want to believe that if the world saw what professional journalists do and how hard we work, and they would be inspired and impressed, and it would be less prone to criticize, but also would be less prone to approve and to cheer wildly the next time Trump points to people, the journalists at the back of the room, and says, lock him up. Again, I'm probably being naive here. But I try to be an optimist.
Oh, that's
Doesn't
important.
get me very far usually. But.
I mean, it seems like these are good things to do, whatever the response from everybody else, right? I mean, I do think that even with New York Times versus Sullivan, I've always had some trouble connecting the complaints that people have about, inaccurate coverage or misleading coverage or coverage that's focused on the wrong issues, and New York Times versus Sullivan. Like, it's not at all obvious to me how weakening New York Times versus Sullivan addresses any of the concerns that you often hear from the people who are complaining about that case. And in fact, if you look at like the Dominion case, or I mean, if you weaken New York Times versus Sullivan, then it's a good chance that the people who are going to feel that most are the very people who are criticizing the case right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, the strongest argument, or the loudest, most persistent argument from the people advocating to overturn or narrow Sullivan are people who claim that it is virtually impossible in this day and age for limited purpose public figures or normal public figures to successfully bring and win defamation cases against the media. And the people, many of the lawyers who are making this argument are very prominent because they have brought and won cases against the media. And so there's really, it's very easy to point to a bunch of examples of this, Dominion being kind of one of the most obvious examples, but there are a lot of others as well, where public figures bring and win cases when the media has been reckless or really irresponsible. So I agree with you. It is, I think it is much truer that the campaign to overturn or narrow Sullivan is not based on a desire to allow people who get harmed by the media, wrongly harmed by the media, to get accountability. It's much more about deterring news organizations or individual journalists from doing this kind of investigative work in the first place. And I think that the toll, even with Sullivan intact, the toll that takes is disproportionately on smaller news organizations, independent journalists, and as you said, a lot of the people that would be like the first dominoes to fall if you weaken or overturn Sullivan it's like things like conservative talk radio, right? And that's part of the reason that I think this hasn't happened. If you look at like DeSantis in Florida several years ago now, and was pushing for legislation at the state level that would directly contravene Sullivan, and he was kind of setting this up in part to create a test case for the Supreme Court. And the reason it died in the state legislature there was that there was an outcry from conservative talk radio saying, if you do this, we are out of business. And that led the Republican-controlled legislature there to very quickly walk away from this. And to me, that is one of the beautiful things about Sullivan, is that it protects everyone who has a voice, whether they are on the left, the right, somewhere in between, whether you're, a traditional journalist or you're an activist or a researcher. And that, to me, it's like a really, again, this is all stuff I felt like I learned as I was doing this book research into, people who are professional lawyers or have thought more about this. This is old news, but it was kind of like a profound awakening I had to the real majesty of this as something that is really truly nonpartisan, and for most of its history has been celebrated as such. It's really very recently that consensus has kind of collapsed, and it coincides directly with Trump coming onto the national scene and taking media bashing not only to a new level, but getting a ton of traction with those attacks.
So what does change if Gorsuch and Thomas find 3 more votes and manage to overturn that precedent? What changes from a legal perspective, but what changes also from a newsroom perspective?
I don't think it's going to happen for the reasons that we, just been talking about. But if it did happen, then journalists would have to would end up being a lot more reluctant to report on government misconduct. If we're talking about core Sullivan, Sullivan says that public officials can't recover for defamation unless they can show actual malice, meaning intentional falsehoods or reckless disregard for the truth, and that creates a lot of space for journalists and others to criticize public officials without having to worry that if they get something slightly wrong, they're going to be subject to years of defamation litigation. Even introducing a kind of slight hesitation into that process, like more than we have right now, I think would be a terrible thing, because even now there's all kinds of situations where journalists just sit on information that they later regret having sat on, and they sit on it for good reasons, because they're checking. They want to make sure that they can stand by what they're going to report, and then later they wish that they had reported earlier, that they had, or that they'd been able to report earlier. I think that happens all the time. There's lots of information that the public gets either doesn't get access to at all, or gets access to, but much later than it should have. And if you introduce a kind of more hesitation into that system than exists already, then the public's just going to have less information about government officials. And there is a balance here. Like, you want the information to be, you want people to check their facts before they put them out there. But government officials do have large platforms to respond to inaccuracies, and they use those platforms, as they should, when there are inaccuracies. And I don't think the problem right now is that there's too much accountability journalism about President Trump, for example. I don't think that's our problem. If there's a problem, it's the opposite, which is that people are hesitating to report aggressively on this administration, because they're terrified of defamation lawsuits or similar actions by the administration. They might be frivolous defamation lawsuits, but they're nonetheless defamation lawsuits that tie you up in court at a minimum for years. And many, I'm sure we'll get to this, many news organizations have felt compelled to settle those lawsuits for large sums of money, even if they are frivolous. So I think that's our problem. Our problem is that journalists are increasingly fearful of reporting about powerful figures, including government officials, and that's even with the protection we have from Sullivan. Mm-hmm. So if that protection were weakened, things would get worse.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's not just government officials, though, either, right? It's like our ability to write about the CEO of a major company, or just a major company itself. And again, we're talking kind of in broad strokes about things happening at a national level. This is even more pronounced and kind of increases in severity exponentially as you kind of go down to smaller news organizations or independent journalists who, it might be as simple as the local newspaper wanting to write a story about a local business owner or someone who is, a real estate developer that's doing something controversial. And there have been many instances where that simple act of journalism gets you sued, or at least you end up facing very serious legal threats. And again, if you're the New York Times, that's not really a problem. We have great in-house lawyers. If you're other major news organizations, not really a problem. But if you are just someone with like a Substack, or you're someone who like works for a community newspaper, the simple act of receiving a letter on expensive-looking letterhead from a high-priced law firm, that completely rationally changes your calculus about whether this is a smart area for you to be digging into and whether it's worth it. And I mean, I spent a lot of time over the past several years talking to local publishers and journalists who face, this is like a real test that they face on a regular basis. It is not about who is going to win, how, like, will the case or will the case not get dismissed? Yes, it will get dismissed, but that could cost you tens of thousands of dollars and suck you into, weeks or months or possibly even years of litigation that you just do not have the time for. So maybe it would make more sense to go find someone else to investigate.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and it strikes me, you brought up organizations like CBS, which do have billions of dollars capitulating to the Trump administration. And it has always struck me that one of the biggest problems with that is, CBS can do what it wants, but then you're not doing the work to sort of preserve the healthy media ecosystem, right? Like, if you're CBS and you can handle those costs, they were big costs, but, CBS on some level could deal with them, at least to get through the appeal process. Little community newspaper that we need doing the ground level investigative reporting, they have no protection, right? Because they're looking and saying, okay, well, if CBS isn't even standing up for themselves, we have no hope. So I'm curious, I know the Knight Institute works with some local papers and folks dealing with these kinds of threats. And I'm curious how you even talk to folks in those positions when it's like, to David's point, like their fears are completely reasonable.
Well, I mean, with CBS, I think, I don't think they made a smart decision even focusing myopically on their own interests. I think it was, hugely damaging to their credibility, to their prestige and their credibility to settle that case. I mean, nobody thought it was a case that CBS would lose in court. Everybody understood it as capitulation to the Trump administration and, almost certainly connected to the merger, Skydance Paramount merger. And then, CBS also agreed to these conditions of the merger, where they installed an ombudsperson, later on installed a new editor-in-chief. I'm not sure that that's directly traceable to the, the merger agreement or not, but, the whole thing, I think, has been terrible for CBS's credibility. And, CBS was, ironically, CBS, established its reputation through its coverage of McCarthy, right? And so they know as an institution, what it's like to stand up to bullies in public office. Like, that's not new for CBS. So it's really disappointing, I think. And even like looking at it myopically from CBS's perspective, just at CBS's interest, I don't see how anyone can think that was, a good move for CBS. Maybe it was a good move for the owners of Skydance or Paramount, but terrible for CBS. The bigger concern is obviously not with CBS specifically, but whenever an institution like CBS capitulates in this way, doesn't defend its First Amendment rights, it creates a kind of precedent, not a legal precedent, but a kind of factual precedent, which I think shapes people's understanding of press freedom. So press freedom has this limit now in people's minds. CBS, absolutely, you're entitled to run an interview with the vice president and edit it. The First Amendment protects your right to do that. But everybody knows that there's this limit, that was set by this case. And then there's a similar, the ABC has done the same, the same thing. And then if you go, one circle out to the social media companies. Meta has this absolutely absurd settlement with the Trump administration over their decision to take down Trump's account after January 6th, which was obviously, there's no argument that Meta was that Meta violated any right that Trump has. To the contrary, the Supreme Court held just 18 months ago that social media companies' content moderation decisions are protected by the First Amendment. So, there too, they're settling a frivolous lawsuit for an obscene amount of money and creating a kind of factual precedent. And I think the problem is, if you look at these deals from the perspective of that particular media or social media company, and only from that perspective, maybe you can get to a point where you think, oh, this is a good idea, or it's the best option we have. But there are externalities, there are kind of social costs that aren't built into that into that dynamic. The creation of these factual precedents isn't, CBS doesn't care about that, but the local newspaper that you just mentioned, they care about that. It's hard to measure this sort of erosion of our collective understanding of press freedom, because it's not reflected in legal decisions. There's no legal decision that says, social media companies can't take down the account of the president. To the contrary, the law says it says the opposite. But in fact, the actual reality of the First Amendment in practice doesn't match what the First Amendment says on the books, and that's increasingly true. Like, we have all these rights on the books, but the most powerful institutions, this goes beyond media institutions to, law firms, universities, the most powerful institutions aren't asserting or defending those rights.
We also saw 2 independent journalists arrested for covering a protest in Minneapolis recently. One is Don Lemon, who is used to have institutional backing, has plenty of wealth, all of that. One is Georgia Ford, who's crowdfunding to cover her legal bills right now. So what's at stake in those cases, and why it feels like a lot of journalists, especially as more and more journalists face the choice between leaving the industry and going independent themselves. I'd love to hear from both of you about sort of what's at play here, because it feels really scary, I think, to a lot of journalists.
I don't know. I feel like this is a tricky one for me because I don't know the facts that well about the specifics. I mean, I've obviously read about the arrests, but I don't know that much about the actual law there. I mean, it's very hard to not see that as fitting into this broader pattern, though, where there's an attack on anyone who is trying to kind of speak truth to power and kind of create transparency in these very high pressure situations. And I think it is really I think it would be a very scary moment to be an independent journalist right now if you're covering stuff like this, because there's just no question that the Trump administration and its allies and state governments are, the restraints that have been imposed on governments in the past. Obviously, there is the First Amendment and there are laws, but so much of this is just been kind of taken for granted that leaders in our country are going to restrain themselves based on, our standards and our norms and the kind of traditions that we have, built in and I think taken for granted in this country. And that's obviously not happening right now in a whole lot of ways. And certainly arresting journalists at a protest, raiding a journalist's house, having the president the sitting president file lawsuits against media companies for coverage he doesn't like. These are all things that I do not think have any precedent in U.S. history, or certainly not in recent U.S. history. And I think they're designed to make it harder for journalists to do journalism. And I think that's working as intended. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what they were doing. They were arrested for journalism. They were covering a protest. And the statute that the Trump administration pointed to, plainly doesn't apply. It doesn't apply to Don Lemon and Georgia Ford. The statute, applies to people who, for the purpose of intimidating people who are engaged in in worship. enter into a house of worship for that purpose, and it just doesn't have any application. So I see it as an effort to intimidate the journalists. I know this is a journalism podcast, but I think it's not just about journalism. It's also about the right to protest. There's this great line that Congressman John Lewis had when he was talking about the civil rights movement. He said, without the press, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings. And it was the press that brought the civil rights movement to the attention of the national public, and it was the press that brought to the public's attention all the abuses of protesters in places like Selma and Montgomery, right? And without the press, the only people who would have known about those abuses were the people who were themselves abused. It just wouldn't have, wouldn't have got public attention. And I think that, I do think this is, these arrests are an effort to intimidate journalists, but they are also an effort to kind of suppress the voices of the protesters, to make it less likely that people in New York City and Houston, Texas are going to know what happened on the streets of Minneapolis or St. Paul, right? I think it's about that too.
Obviously, it's tough out there for people looking for full-time journalism jobs. We just saw 300 plus lose their jobs at the Washington Post. And Jameel, you recently posted on Blue Sky, I want to read this because I want to get the wording right, but you said after the Post layoffs that the biggest threats to journalism in this country and to the possibility of an informed and empowered electorate stem from the political economy of the media. So that's a little bit different than legal threats, government threats. And I'm curious to hear a little more about how you think about that threat and why it stands out to you as, the most urgent right now.
So first, I get really nervous when people start by saying, you posted something on Blue Sky.
It's like my worst nightmare.
Right? Okay, but this one I think I can handle. All right. Well, so I was thinking about two different things. So one is the capitulation of these big news organizations to the Trump administration. I didn't mention the Washington Post, but obviously, the Washington Post, even before Trump returned to office, nixed that editorial, the endorsement of Kamala Harris, not because the publisher disagreed or Bezos disagreed with the content of it, but as I understand it, because he didn't want to cross Trump. He just thought it was too risky to cross Trump, right? So it's not just CBS and ABC, it's also the Washington Post and maybe the LA Times, and the list probably goes on. But so why are they capitulating, right? Like why are they, and it's tempting to say, well, it's just a matter of kind of personal courage or personal character. And I'm sure that there's that element to it. But I think it's also the kind of regulatory environment in which those people are operating, right? So, I already talked about CBS and the merger. Like, the Trump administration has these levers, right? The FCC is now threatening, has already started to investigate CBS for the same thing that Trump sued them over. Is threatening to investigate other news organizations for news distortion. These are levers that the administration has. They're kind of economic levers that allow them to impose financial penalties. And all that power was kind of latent before the Trump administration came along. And maybe I'm just not aware of the way that previous administrations used this power, but I wasn't aware of it. This is the first time I'm really seeing it. And I don't think we're going to get to a place where billionaire owners of major media companies are more courageous with respect to the government without changing the regulatory framework that they're operating in. So that was one of the things I was thinking about. And then the other was, we've done a lot of work at the Knight Institute on issues relating to Americans' access to ideas from abroad. And so I grew up in Canada. In Canada, they have these CanCon laws, Canadian content laws, where radio stations and television stations are required to carry Canadian content. A certain percentage of their airtime has to be given over to Canadian content, because Canadians have always been terrified that their distinctive culture will be overwhelmed by the United States. And we don't have those kinds of laws here, but we have the opposite problem. Because American culture is just so powerful that unless you create unless you legally mandate access to ideas from abroad, Americans are going to be in a bubble. Like, we're just going to be in a total bubble. And it's even worse because there's so few, media is so concentrated in the United States. There's just a few, the biggest media organizations are owned by the same handful of people. And so it's not just that we're isolated from information and ideas from abroad, but the information and ideas that circulate internally are kind of limited by the structure of the environment. So, I'm a First Amendment lawyer, and I tend to think of problems in First Amendment terms. Like, I look for a case or controversy, and then some legal principle that can resolve that case or controversy. But I don't actually think the biggest problems relating to our information environment right now are susceptible to that kind of, they don't need that kind of hammer. They need some other tool, because the problems are these. They have to do with the organization of the whole landscape, and this question of, like, should Americans have access to TikTok? I think is sort of tied up in. It sort of raises the same kinds of questions. Like, the Supreme Court addressed that question relatively recently and said that the TikTok ban was constitutional, was fine. The national security threat that they had in mind was the Chinese government is going to exploit this tool and gather all sorts of information about Americans, and whether they were right to see that as a real threat, I'd sort of bracket, but they didn't see the threat of Americans being relegated to a kind of informational bubble, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really big problem for us. It's a really big problem that we are so disconnected from the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. I have about 700 more questions, but I want to let the other folks in this room have a chance to ask questions. So I guess we'll do that.
Hi. Fabio Bertoni, I'm General Counsel at The New Yorker. I guess my question is whether it will be possible to put the genie back in the bottle with a lot of these things. It seems to me that, I've spent my career focusing on First Amendment and press protection issues. But a lot of the lawsuits brought by this administration, the actions against Don Lemon and the Washington Post reporter seem to throw legal rules that are applicable aside. There's the Privacy Protection Act, which prevents the government from getting certain documents from reporters. The administration ignored that in their search warrant for Natanson at the Washington Post. And I've had experience with implied threats from White House comms people that we are aiding and abetting lawless activity, protesters, et cetera, by the act of reporting on it, which seems to me something that they are considering with the Don Lemon situation. So again, when you have an administration that's willing to chuck the law out the window when it's convenient for them, even if courts then later say, no, you did that wrong, are we confident that, if there is a post-Trump period, that we can revert back to a world where the rules apply once again?
No. I mean, I think that's a broad issue that a lot of people are worried about, not just in the context of the First Amendment or journalism, but just with this huge increase in presidential power or asserted presidential power across the board, whether it's with journalists or Venezuelan boat strikes or a whole other raft of things where one of the traditional restraints on the presidency was not just the law and not just the Constitution, but a kind of a shared American understanding of the spirit of these limitations. And that seems to be out the window to a large extent. And what prevents, there will be like a post-Trump period, right? He's not gonna live forever at the barest minimum. But like, what stops the next president, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, from saying, well, the president was set, why not, use this power for a purpose that I see as good or justified? And I think, just speaking about journalism, I think that is going to be a real test for journalists, to make sure that if there's someone in power who is trying to suppress things or do anything like that, the journalists are kind of consistent and principled in, the one thing that we can all be biased about, which is that we believe in a strong First Amendment. We believe in people's rights to freely express themselves, and we believe in the right and the responsibility of journalists to do their best to be clear and transparent and truthful, and not do that for the interests of one politician or one party or another. And I think that, I imagine that's something that's going to be tested in the years ahead when, there will be different presidents, but these precedents will still exist.
Yeah, I think this is one place where, maybe there is a regulatory solution that would actually make a real dent, and that is, so 40 years ago, the Supreme Court decided this case called Bivens, which, at that time was understood to mean that people would be able to sue for damages for violations of their constitutional rights. And, since then, the court has basically backtracked gradually on Bivens to the point where it's really been limited to its facts. So now if certain kinds of Fourth Amendment violations, you might be able to sue for damages, but for most other constitutional violations, there's no hope of holding any government official monetarily accountable for their violation of the Constitution. And I think that has huge implications for it. Explains a lot about the world we're living in right now, because right now, I think the Trump administration doesn't really care about court orders holding that they are in violation of the Constitution, because the only possible remedy is a kind of prospective one where the court says, don't do it anymore, And even then, if they do it, the only possible remedy is the court saying again, like I said before, don't do it anymore, So, so they don't care, there's just no penalty for violating the Constitution, and with state officials, it is possible. There's a statute that people can use to hold state officials accountable for violating the federal Constitution, but you can't do it with federal officials. And this is a very simple extension of an existing principle. Just extend the same liability regime that applies to state officials to federal officials as well. And it's been proposed multiple times. In the last few weeks, in the in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, they've both had op-eds on this on this point. So this is not this is not some secret. Everybody knows what the solution is. I think that that actually would have a really big impact on the willingness of federal officials would think twice before doing the kinds of things that you see for example, ICE agents doing in in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. Well, can I say one more thing on this point? So I also find it very difficult to understand how we get from here to like a better place, but we did kind of go through something like this. I mean, none of us were around, but this is kind of like what happened during the first Red Scare in the First World War and right after the First World War. There was a similar kind of crackdown on speech and the press, and we somehow came back from that. And the same with the second Red Scare after the Second World War and the McCarthy era. We kind of rebuilt after that, and we rebuilt in the 1970s, after all the disclosures of the abuses relating to Watergate and the Vietnam War, and built new institutions of accountability. And again, it's not obvious to me how we go from here to that kind of more optimistic perspective way of thinking, but the fact that we've done it before gives me a certain amount of hope.
Hello, my name's Sahai. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Columbia Spectator. I'm wondering about a situation we dealt with last semester where 2 of our reporters were suspended for covering a protest in Butler Library. Those suspensions were rescinded by the university, but that still was a threat to us. And I know you all talked a lot about local newspapers and smaller newspapers who don't have the backing of big institutions, but I'm wondering, what can student journalists do to protect themselves, and how do we balance being a reporter but also being students who have universities who maybe have capitulated to the administration?
Well, I remember that incident that you're talking about. I mean, it is very similar to the sort of Don Lemon and Georgia Fort situation, where they went into the church to cover the protest. I mean, I guess I'm not really sure how to answer your question. I mean, I think it was, the university was obviously wrong to pursue those charges, and they were right to drop the charges. I don't know what kind of legal help the Spectator had in deciding how to respond. I assume the Spectator has, good legal counsel, but to the extent you ever need additional support, you can reach out to us, and we will we'll do what we can. But I think student journalists are facing the same kinds of issues that other journalists are facing, because they're covering the same things, right? In some ways, you have it harder because there's this additional leverage that can be when you're trying to cover your own university. You're covering an actor that has a particular kind of leverage over you. That makes it more complicated. I don't have any great solution to that.
And my only advice, my main thing is just to express my admiration for, I think this is the hardest time in a long time for student journalists to do their jobs properly, especially when covering issues and a whole raft of issues. So I tip my cap to all of you guys who are doing that. I also just think in general, when bad things happen, one of the best solutions, obviously get a good lawyer, but also make a stink about it. Use your power as journalists to shed light and really shine a focused light on what's happening, because usually if it's bad, that will generate outrage, which will create pressure on the university or on whoever else is causing the trouble in the first place. And I don't think that's a guaranteed successful outcome, but I think it at least helps your odds.
We could get in one more question.
There's one back there.
Oh, perfect.
David, you spoke about the crisis of public trust in journalists and how maybe solving the crisis of public trust could help solve the larger crisis. But I'm curious, aren't folks like Alan Dershowitz or Justice Clarence Thomas or President Trump really the only actors that matter in this sort of fight? Because they're the decision makers who change, the landscape for journalists. If we solve that crisis of public trust, what does that provide to maybe CBS facing a lawsuit from the Trump administration?
Well, I'm not sure it solves anything for at least directly, for the institution or the individual who's facing the lawsuit. What I think it changes is the climate in which those things exist. And I think when you have a broad climate in the public where journalists and news organizations are viewed with suspicion and distrust, that is really fertile ground for people like Trump or Dershowitz or Clarence Thomas to make their argument and for their arguments to gain traction and momentum. And I think reasonable people can legitimately disagree about like the exact contours of the First Amendment or defamation law or things like that. I'm not trying to necessarily be an absolutist on that, but when there is a widespread view, rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, that journalists as like a species are bad actors and abuse the public trust and abuse the kind of legal privilege that they may or may not have been provided, I think that it just makes these attacks, whether they're legal attacks or public attacks or whatever, just much more potent. And so our best defense against that is to meet the public where they're at and kind of, at least in my opinion, and to kind of do everything we can to rebuild trust. And that is not a passive thing. That's not just doing our jobs better and like having fewer corrections or whatever. It's going out there forcefully and creatively and ambitiously and thinking about what we can do, especially with like a whole new generation of news consumers who, I like write for newspapers. That's like what I grew up reading. Like I have kids who are 12 and 9. They like literally do not know what a newspaper is. That's not true. They do know what it is, but they like wouldn't be caught dead reading it. They are, and that's fine, right? Like young people are going to consume news and information in a different way than I did when I was young. And yet most of my colleagues at the New York Times grew up consuming information the same way I did. And so we have to figure out a way. I mean, this is obviously a much broader issue than just rebuilding trust, right? It's how does our business model survive? But I do think it's like there's lots of great things happening in the media world right now that in theory make it easier for us to establish direct, clear, open relationships with our readers. And that's the best way to rebuild trust, to the extent that we're acting responsibly and in good faith, which I think we almost always are. And so we should be taking advantage of things like TikTok. We should be taking advantage of newsletters that have voice and speaking like human beings one to another in a way that is not like treating our profession and our peers as if we operate in some some sacred remove, right? We're journalists, we're trying to figure out what the truth is. We have very interesting and nuanced and complicated ways of doing that. We are imperfect, we make mistakes, we try to acknowledge our mistakes, and I can go on, you guys know this drill, but like we just need to do it, find new ways to do it where it is actually, where we're hearing what people are saying and listening to them and trying to address their concerns and their frustrations, some of which are garbage and mean-spirited and dishonest, but some of them are valid.
Mm-hmm. What a good note to end on. Thank you all for coming to this special live taping of The Kicker. Thank you so much to our producer, Amanda Darrach, and to our wonderful video crew. The Kicker is a production of the Columbia Journalism Review. I'm your host, Megan Greenwell, and thank you so much to our lovely guests today, Jameel Jaffer, David Enrich, and for all of you listening at home, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts.